Peace Camp. So our second speaker of the day is Mei Folger, who will explore the impacts of the climate crisis on a key pillar of a gender-just, sustainable peace economic recovery. So we will look at the inextricable links between the climate crisis and economic reconstruction in indigenous, formal, informal, and extractive economies. So Mei Folger is a master's student in global environment, politics, and society at the University of Edinburgh. She has been conducting research for the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights as part of the Feminist Roadmap for Sustainable Peace and Planet project. Sounds very exciting. To assess how climate change shapes the prospect of gender-just, sustainable peace in post-conflict countries. So her research focuses primarily on the gender-just and sustainable economic recovery of post-conflict countries. Oh, sorry, I repeated that. So aside from her studies, Mei is a committed climate education activist. She and others have been building the Climate Fresque in the UK, a project built on the recognition that strengthening climate change education is one of the most impactful social tipping interventions for stabilizing Earth's climate. Mei is a senior facility and trainer of the Climate College alongside the global community of Climate Fresque facilitators. She has raised awareness and understanding about the climate crisis amongst 200,000 people, a community that grows exponentially. So welcome, Mei.
Thank you. What a comprehensive introduction. I don't even have anything to say myself anymore, except that I'm French. I live in London. I used to study in Edinburgh, like you said, Vanessa, and I'm now calling from Milano in Italy. And today, yes, I'll be sharing with you some of the findings that I report in my master thesis, which investigated how climate change shapes the prospects for gender-just, sustainable peace. And like you said, Vanessa, I conducted this research project in partnership with the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, which is a research institution based in Boston and directed by Dr. Carol Kahn, who's known for addressing issues of gender in international politics and particularly in war and peace. So I was really attracted by the prospects of conducting research for the consortium because of their truly radical take on both peace and the climate crisis and what the sort of transformative and systemic solutions it requires. And for me, that was so well done with the project of the consortium is just so amazing. And I'll be talking about that during this presentation today. And I guess there are two keywords in my presentation today. The first one is climate change, obviously, and the second one is gender just, sustainable peace. And I'm interested in the sort of inextricable links between the two, like you said, Vanessa. So the concept of gender just, sustainable peace actually took me quite a bit of time to fully understand the scope of this concept. And I want to say that these are my views and probably don't always reflect what the consortium thinks. Just putting this out there because I don't want to, say something that the consortium wouldn't want to publicly say. Who knows? So this concept was framed by feminist researchers of the consortium, so Carol Kahn herself and Claire Duncanson, who's also a leading researcher in international relations at the University of Edinburgh, where I study. And obviously the second concept is climate change, and you've heard this 1,000 times. The climate crisis is increasingly apparent today. Some of its impacts include extreme weather events, droughts, floods, heat waves, wildfires, long-term changes in average temperature, or increasingly erratic rainfall patterns, or scarcer and scarcer resources. This is only to name a few impacts. And feminists have been asking, well, why should we care? And especially, or more specifically, why should we care in a feminist way? And the consortium has been looking at this question specifically in post-conflict / peace building countries. So why should we care? The first reason we should really care is because climate change undermines human security. As per the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, which is the authority on climate science, as per their 5th assessment report and now the 6th, which was released recently, climate change threatens women and marginalized people's human security most. And this has implications for a gender just sustainable peace, which we understand that as a peace that takes into account or that ensures women's human security and that is environmentally as well as politically sustainable. I'll talk about this concept a little bit more later, but I just want to frame what climate change does to begin with. So some research conducted by someone called Emilia Go, for example, has highlighted 6 ways in which climate change may impact women and men differently. Those 6 ways are related to agricultural production first, food security, but also health, water and energy resources and access to those resources, and climate-induced migration and conflicts. And finally, climate-related natural disasters. So all those things may impact men and women differently. By way of example, for example, that's twice examples, but anyway. In terms of natural disasters, we saw that in the tsunami that hit India back in 2014, women were more affected because culturally it's not so accepted for them to run and to climb trees as girls or to be able to swim. So, this kind of like gendered division of social roles, but also care roles. Women are in this area of India, women were more allocated to household care roles, whilst men were out in the sea, which enabled them to escape the tsunami better. And when the wave hit, women couldn't run, women couldn't swim to save themselves, and women often had to care for children, which made them the last sort of person on the line to be saved in a way. So this is just an example, but that's one way climate change exacerbates the insecurity of people and the vulnerability of women particularly, and creating an environment that simply cannot be called safe or peaceful for women and marginalized people. So that's one reason we should care. Another reason we should care is that we find in recent studies that gender inequality, climate vulnerability, and state fragility are positively correlated. So this is the results of 2 studies in particular, one study conducted by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, the IUCN, and the United States Agency for International Development, the USAID. So this positive correlation, what does it mean? It means that in places where in already fragile contexts, such as post-conflict peace-building contexts, obviously peace is going to be harder to achieve if climate change comes in and compounds already existing structural inequalities, gender inequalities, and post-conflicts fragile situation by adding a certain number of biophysical complications. By biophysical, I mean all sorts of nature, environmental related complications. And the third reason we should care, and this is not the last one, is because climate change can play a role in extending or intensifying armed conflicts, which is obviously a direct impediment to a gender just sustainable peace, or the project for a gender just sustainable peace. So it's not that climate change is a direct cause of conflicts. That would be a bit of a strong take on the question, but it's more the case that it may increase the risk of conflicts by exacerbating long-standing inequalities or post-conflict insecurities. For example, there are a number of reviews that point to the various vectors of insecurity that may be exacerbated by climate change. And some of those vectors are livelihood insecurity, which includes tensions over communal resources or reliance on transboundary water resources, or displacement and migrations, or volatile markets as a result of climate change. But another concern is the tactical considerations amongst armed groups who may exploit natural disasters or resource scarcity to capture disaffection or grievances against the state. So this was found, for example, in Mali and Somalia. We're seeing a surge in non-state armed forces as a result of water scarcity, for example. And the last point is that environmental disasters, such as extreme weather events or sea level rise and coastal degradation, all this also hinder the efforts in terms of building peace. And where, in order to avoid a relapse into conflict, we would need, or people would need, access to livelihood security, a sense of justice or non-corrupt politics, or the belief that they can count on sound state institutions. So the climate crisis undermines all those factors, and in that way, it can play a role in extending or in intensifying armed conflicts. So that's just to say that even if we go back to a traditional security angle, even there, the climate crisis should be taken into consideration and seriously, because it could be a big problem. But that's not to say that we should increase militarization, because obviously that would lead to more problems, which brings me to another point, which is that climate change undermines peace-building efforts as they are done today, but also as we would wish to do them tomorrow according to a gender just sustainable peace agenda. So indeed, peace building requires a number of mechanisms. The provision of jobs and livelihoods to reconstruct the economy, or addressing issues of land reform and restitution, as well as issues of injustice and health that may have been neglected during wartime. It also requires financial resources to make peace agreements happen, but also to invest in physical as well as social infrastructures. And at the same time, well, climate change can destroy all those conditions and the conditions required to maintain traditional livelihoods, to reduce the quantity it will reduce the quantity and quality of land available, and it will increase competition of resources. That's just to name a few impacts of climate change. It may also cause new health issues and threaten physical infrastructures with extreme weather events, and all of this can contribute to making financial funds scarcer. If more funds are allocated to the climate crisis, less funds will be allocated to building peace, or building peace in a gender just sustainable way. So this is only to paraphrase research by Carol Cohn, which I truly encourage you to read. But it's to say and to point and underscore the fact that climate change makes building peace all the more complicated. And especially when we're faced with a sense of tyranny of the urgent, which consistently puts gender last on the scale of priorities in peace-building countries. And last point is that peace-building will obviously have to change in response to the climate crisis. Already unrelated to feminist theory, a number of recent reports already underscore the inadequacy of mainstream peace building in the face of climate change. For example, research conducted by Matthews in 2012 showed that mainstream peace building happens with barely any mechanism for screening and responding to climate risks. In 2018, a UN Security Council resolution, the resolution number 2423, which renewed the mandate for MINUSMA, the UN peace operation in Mali. That was the first ever to mention the adverse effects of climate change on stability and peace. So that's just to say, yes, climate change for the first time was mentioned in 2018 as a risk to peace. But this is just mainstream peace building, which continues to treat peace as gender neutral and which conceals the decision-making processes that actually cover gendered issues but remain untalked about. So while this is true of mainstream peace building, it's also true of feminist peace. And until recently, the implications of the climate crisis for feminist peace had remained largely invisible. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda, for example, which is the UN security, which was inaugurated after UN Security Council Resolution 1325, which was the first resolution ever to take women or a sort of feminist peace into account. Well, to this day, this Women and Peace and Security Agenda barely makes an active mention of climate change. Only 17 out of 80 countries which have signed the Women, Peace and Security or adopted the Women, Peace and Security Agenda make a mention of climate change or have a specific plan to address climate crisis related security risks. Besides, feminist researchers of the consortium point a number of issues with the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and that's why they actually came up with the concept of gender just sustainable peace, because there were a number of limitations with the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, which pertain to the fact that the agenda was implemented as part of the UN, and obviously that's going to count limitations in itself. That's going to include limitations to the agenda in itself. So just to name, for example, one problem. In feminist peace, women continue, in the very few peace building projects that include climate change, women continue to be framed as either victims disproportionately affected by the climate breakdown, or sustainability saviors, sustainability heroes, which is also the narrative that happens in peace building. They're often framed as either as war victims or peace heroes. So it's always, on either side of the spectrum or in those extreme areas, and doesn't really account for their agency or power or all that in vulnerability context, or just the complexity of their lives as they go through a sort of peace process or the climate crisis overall. So how does all that relate to the concept of gender just sustainable peace? Like I said earlier, gender just sustainable peace, that's a concept that, well, that's understood as peace that ensures women's human security and that is politically as well as environmentally sustainable. And this is a definition that should be understood against the background of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda and the feminist research surrounding it. So for those who don't know what it is, I briefly introduced it before, but the Women, Peace and Security Agenda started with the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 in the 2000s. So that was more than 20 years ago. It was, for the time, a sort of revolutionary agenda, because for the first time it took a feminist perspective into account and brought it into the United Nations Security Council. So now it includes 10 resolutions, this Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and particularly it points to three things. The first is the gendered impacts of war, which is more often than not the sexual and gender-based violence that women face during war or forced displacements, but also how often the people who are sent to keep peace are the perpetrators of violence against women in peace-building countries. Second point the Women, Peace and Security Agenda makes is that women have agency in wartime, and their potential to contribute to solutions is immense, and therefore their continued exclusion is hugely problematic. And finally, the Women, Peace and Security agenda points to the role gender plays in causing war and demonstrates the way in which patriarchal gender relations interact with nationalism and capitalism and tend to predispose nations to wars or conflicts. And it also points to the sort of symbolic connotations that war and peace have in our language, with war traditionally perceived as a masculine, active, realistic, as a masculine, active, realistic act, whilst peace would be perceived as a passive, slow, soft, compromising, accommodating act, and therefore rarely seems like an option for state leaders or military leaders wanting to be taken seriously. So at the time, the fact that women needs would be integrated into the United Nations Security Council was revolutionary. I've said this already, and only that took a lot of work from feminists inside and outside of the UN. But there is a dark side to the strategy, like I've evoked before, and a number of feminists today regret a number of things about the WPS, the Women, Peace and Security agenda. To give one example only, which pertains to the economic recovery side of things, which I'm interested in, research by True and Hewitt found that the relief and recovery pillar of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is arguably super important for peace building, is the most underdeveloped, under-researched, and misinterpreted of the 4 pillars of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. It's all too often reduced to the recovery and reparations of women, mainly in relation to sexual violence. And although this is absolutely necessary, the focus on sexual violence shouldn't come at the expense of recovery projects addressing women's social and economic rights and their needs for social and economic recovery in a post-conflict context. So scholars of the Women, Peace and Security agenda have since pressed for a greater understanding of those wider structural inequalities faced by women and marginalized people in terms of socio-economic rights. But until recently, very little attention had been given to climate change as a prominent cause of inequality, including economic inequality in post-conflict settings, which then prevents what we want in terms of gender just sustainable peace. Which sort of brings me back to the point about climate change, which is that that was 20 years ago. And 20 years ago, climate change was not taken as seriously as it is today. And we know that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of taking it seriously. So it's now become an urgent and pressing issue on the political agenda, but also for feminists to address climate change in their projects for a gender just sustainable peace. So here, what I keep calling gender just sustainable peace, and which is a concept that was framed by feminist researchers of the consortium, I understand it as a concept that, or as a transformative project that seeks to palliate the gaps of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And thus, the gender just sustainable peace concept extends well beyond the areas of concern of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And at its core, it's truly based on the recognition that the climate crisis was caused and worsened by structural violence in the form of patriarchal power relations and neo-colonial and neoliberal extractive economic development models. So that's where it goes really further. It really seeks to address the root causes of the issues and considers both climate change and war and conflicts a result of those very power relations which I've just named. So it makes the point, the gender just sustainable peace makes the point for a radical overhaul of the structural dynamics that can cause both climate change and conflicts, or a relapse into conflict. And as it is understood by feminists of the consortium, it will pave the way for structural and transformative changes necessary for a more socially just and environmentally sustainable world. And that's just to say, this gender just sustainable peace, today it's been conceptualized as a concept, but the sort of true agenda for it is yet to be defined. And that's why the consortium is today doing a lot of work and organizing workshops in October to build this gender just sustainable peace sort of agenda. So that's also to say that it's a fairly recent concept and there isn't a definitive answer for all that it entails. But there are three key points probably that we can make. First of all, gender just sustainable peace requires a set of material conditions, necessarily both to avoid a relapse into conflict and as a basis for the enjoyment of equal rights and opportunities. So these may include food, water, shelter, money, mobility, health, time. And that's why it relates quite well to the point that climate change undermines human security, because human security is the access to those material conditions as well. Secondly, it also requires a set of institutional arrangements specific to post-conflict countries. So the provision of justice to repair specific war-related harms, or a health system addressing specific needs, whether they be psychological or physical, that went unaddressed during the war, or the creation and support of gender inequality and the elimination of discrimination in post-conflict countries, although arguably it's difficult to come into a peace-building country and just say, oh, here's how you do gender equality. It probably doesn't really work like that, but just putting it out there. And finally, it advocates for improving the social, political, and economic structures that used to fuel both wars and the climate crisis, and sort of tweak or completely change, because it's not a question of tweaking, but transform the root causes of the problem and challenge those very patriarchal, neocolonial, neoliberal, and extractive norms that are the operatives of power that cause both climate change and conflicts. So that's about the gender just sustainable peace concept. And that's not an exhaustive list. Other goals will be and can be conceptualized using gender analysis to examine the differences between women and men's lives, and the differences which lead to social and economic inequality for women and marginalized people. So for example, a few questions we could ask in a gender analysis is, do peace-building frameworks promote equality and justice? Do they empower people to enhance their potential, both collectively and individually? On a more practical level, also looking into the sort of mundane of peace-building practices, are employment schemes inclusive of women? Do women have access to telecommunications? Do land tenure systems and agricultural policies support the multi-cropping of small-scale farmers? Or do they only support agribusiness monocrops, usually led by international firms, and which contributes to land grabbing and the theft of land? Do road building plans prioritize access to healthcare or schools or markets, or are they only highways to facilitate the large extraction of natural resources in fragile countries, and often resource-rich countries? So those are the sort of questions that are necessary to tackle the root mechanisms that continue to fuel both the climate crisis and wars. And I think it's important to highlight as well that gender here is used as a theoretical framework to expose and address those inequalities between all vectors of identity, not just women. And I know I've talked a lot about women, but we're also interested in how gender just sustainable peace as a concept also encompasses the way that different groups of men can be marginalized by post-war processes, and the necessity of tackling hierarchies amongst men and as well as between men and women. So gender analysis will be the perfect frame to explore those sort of context, power relations and roles in society. So in my master's dissertation, I investigated specifically the sort of economic recovery side of gender just sustainable peace. There are more to economic recovery. There is, like I've mentioned, social recovery. There is also the provision of justice and other physical needs as well, in terms of physical infrastructure, rebuilding physical infrastructure. But I couldn't do all of those, obviously. So instead, I formulated a framework that would help future research investigate those pillars of peace against the background of climate change and for gender just sustainable peace. So I won't spend too much time introducing this framework, but I can just say a few words about it. The framework proposes a three-step approach. Firstly, mapping out the climate signals. So all the consequences of climate change that I've mentioned before, whether they be sea level rise or loss in agriculture, agricultural yields, and how those climate signals interact with a certain vulnerability background. And the vulnerability background is made up of four sort of criteria: gender-specific characteristics, whether they be for men and women, and others. Specific post-conflict characteristics, biophysical assets, so everything that I've mentioned in terms of access to food, water, this will come into this category. And finally, why? I've lost my fourth category. Just a second. And structural inequalities, of course. So the sort of, structural inequalities that permeate society. And then once we've identified this vulnerability background, we measure them against the needs for gender just sustainable peace in a specific country. And then to sort of identify those needs, we go back to the definition of gender just sustainable peace, and we do a gender analysis in a specific country to understand what are those needs and how we can do to answer them. And as we bring those two bodies of literature or evidence together, we identify specifically where climatic impacts meets gender just sustainable peace requirements and undermines them or exacerbates inequalities or complicates them, or who knows, maybe even simplifies them, because sometimes climate change can result in somehow positive, although it's never entirely positive. But sometimes, for example, in Afghanistan, in the mountains, climate change means higher temperature, which means that you can grow different types of seeds and wheat longer throughout bigger periods of the year. So that means more food, but also more economy. But there are obvious side effects, such as the cultivation of poppy, which will then mean more opium, which will then mean more money to the Taliban. But going back to higher temperatures as well, it also means that there's less snow in the mountain, which increases the presence of Talibans, because then they can fight. It's easier to fight when there is no snow. Anyway, all those things, this is the kind of stuff that we need to map out to understand how climate change undermines gender just sustainable peace. And then, well, I guess that was one of my examples, but I have a few more case studies, which for the clarity of this presentation, I chose to only focus on the agricultural sector in economic recovery. That'll enable us to keep a more focus. So about the agricultural sector, I choose this sector because in many peace building countries where development was stalled by armed conflicts, agriculture remains the main economic sector and livelihood option for people. So it becomes a key source of livelihood. And although a number of post-conflict issues may forestall the development of the agricultural sector, such as, for example, there is the destruction of physical infrastructure, the possibility that fields may have become landmines, or the displacement and relocation of people, and the inefficiency of the administrative system in dealing with the retribution of stolen land, etc. So now we're seeing, on top of that, climate change increasing those complications. The IPCC special report on climate change and land concluded with high confidence that climate disasters are a major constraint on the economic recovery of the agricultural sector. Food scarcity has been identified as a key driver of conflict by the FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, FAO, not FAO, which found a correlation between food insecurity and violent conflict and social inequality. But also the UN has identified food security and gender equality as necessary elements of peace. So that's just to say, again, all those elements, they are part of the conception of gender just sustainable peace. And we see clearly that they are undermined by climate change. So Mali provides a good example. For example, after years of war and now crumbling institutions, Mali is facing the new crisis of climate change, a crisis on top of a crisis. In Mali, where both pastoralism and agriculture rely on the rainy season, variations in rainfall patterns have undermined the peaceful relations between farmers and herders. So with increasingly erratic rainfall patterns and longer drought seasons, herders have had to travel further to find adequate land for grazing their cattle, and thus they enter territory where they don't have good working relations with farmers, and that can result into conflicts. But it would be overtly simplistic to claim that climate change is the cause of insecurity, of this kind of insecurity in Mali. Rather, feminist analysis reveals that this insecurity lies within the broader structural system in which production and herding agricultural production and herding takes place in the first place. So it's not that erratic rainfall patterns per se cause conflict, but it's the system within which erratic rainfall patterns happens and the kind of insecurities it taps into. And so, for example, research by Benjaminson et al. Found that colonialism played a key role in the sort of water-related conflicts that we're seeing today in Mali, because colonial structures favored the rice production in Mali against at the expense of pastoral land. That meant that herders had less land already to migrate, and they found themselves migrating around narrower livestock corridors. And that caused, in part, the disputes between farmers and herders that we're seeing today, as the availability of good land shrinks even further today. Because they changed the sort of power dynamics between farmers and herders back during colonial days, we're seeing still the impacts of that today. So that's just to say that climate change never happens in a vacuum. It's always against the background of structural inequality, vulnerability, gender power relations, or marginalized power relations between marginalized and less marginalized people. And this is why feminist analysis of the situations is so important. I'm worried about the time, so I'm not sure I will continue with those too many case studies, but maybe one last one about from Uganda. Again, in Uganda, most of the country relies on crop lands, and agriculture employs 72% of the population, and it accounts for 50% of the country's exports. And we're seeing again, in terms of a sort of climate change compounding structural inequalities, where households with less able-bodied members, or households with less educated people, or households held by women are found by research to be more vulnerable to climate variability and change. Similarly, in Uganda, women report that when they invest their time and resources in farming, they don't get good yields because of climate change, and then they're blamed by their spouse for stealing the food and taking it to their parents. But it's the yields that are poor, it's not the women that are stealing. This leads into conflicts at home, and this has been reported in a number of other various countries as well. They also report once the environment is tampered with, people's survival is threatened, peace is compromised, and of course, women are still expected to ensure that their families survive in that unstable environment. So this is a woman in Uganda testifying on how hard climate change is making her life today, especially as she's already struggling with a lot of poverty. So we're not only seeing this in Africa, we're seeing this in Palestine as well. We're seeing this in Afghanistan. I've briefly mentioned the example of Afghanistan, but I think it's important to come back to it in light of the recent context. Afghanistan is increasingly facing harsh climatic conditions, and it's received a massive precipitation deficit due to climate change in recent years and the alteration of La Nina effect, which is a weather event, which coincides with the main harvest season in Afghanistan. And that's prevented the agriculture production of Afghan cereals. And to counter hunger and malnutrition and poverty, people have turned to other crops, and opium, which is relatively drought tolerant, has been found as a lucrative alternative. But obviously, opium, the poppy cultivation, people who do that must share their earnings with the Taliban, and that contributes to more power to Taliban people. So, and possibly in the situation that we're seeing today, this is not to say that it's the only cause, but obviously that it's part of the causes. So just a word to conclude, and then we will stop here with all the doom and gloom. When we begin understanding the enormous character of climate change, it becomes quite hard to imagine how we may even open new pathways for future peace building. But this is not a reason to become all depressed. We are yet to fully understand and grab the full scope of climate change and where its impacts will be the largest, whose life it will affect, but also how long and how irreversibly it will change our economic world. And it's also sometimes difficult, and for good reason, to distinguish between the social events and effects that belong to climate change. Sometimes some of the gendered inequalities that we see in peace building countries pertain more adequately to the after effects of capitalism or systemic gender inequality. But what's always the case is that climate change will aggravate or exacerbate or cause further gender inequality, gender injustice, unsustainability. It will make it all the more complicated to build a peace, the kind of peace that we want for the future of our planet and the future of the people on this planet. And so that's the sort of final word of my research, that climate change as we know it, as a man-made ecological and humanitarian crisis, exacerbates, intensifies forms of sufferings that already exist and that are experienced by the poor, the marginalized, those who are Black and brown, those who are disabled, those whose livelihoods and health conditions and safety is already compromised. And so if we really want to tackle the root causes of climate change, we've got to look into the sort of social and economic inequalities that already exist. And it's very difficult today, and that's the conclusion of the Gender Just Sustainable Peace kind of agenda. Also, which is that effective conclusions cannot be framed outside of those social and economic inequalities that already exist, and that's why we need to investigate them. That's the final word of this short presentation, but feel free to ask any question.
Thank you so much, Mei. Round of applause. I see some hands going up and some comments that it's very insightful. And might I say, it is incredible, the work and research that you've been doing. That was a lot of information that you gave us, and I really enjoyed the case studies because I feel like it really illuminates the kind of work and why we need such a framework. I just would like to ask you a question to start off, and maybe I'll open it up too if people do have other questions, but and I know you're not representing the Consortium on Gender Security and Human Rights, but I just wanted to know when did it start and what are the aims of the organization? And then if I can, for a follow-up question, was there any impact, if any, from the latest report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to your research, and how if it has impacted or if there's anything in there that you want to relay to us?
Okay, yeah, so with the first question, how long has it been going on and what's the sort of future projects, is that right? It's been going on, I'm not entirely sure in precise terms, but I know that it's always been in response to the sort of gaps found in the Women, Peace and Security agenda by researchers of the consortium. Researchers of the consortiums, for them, the key thing is truly they want to do a transformative reform or a non-reformist reform, one that will address the root causes of the issue. And so that's been going on probably in their mind for a lot of time, but now it's concretized. It's become more and more concrete in very recent years, and I know they have a way of working that uses or brings together feminists from all around the world and from all walks of experience and all types of jobs to reflect together on the kind of policy recommendations they can formulate. So they've been building the theoretical background for the feminist roadmap for sustainable peace and planet, and now this is being concretized in the next few months with a workshop in October, for example. I hope that answers your question. When it comes to the IPCC, the latest report, for me, the IPCC's latest report, because I'm so immersed in climate news, I don't think it says anything new to me, except that the situation is not getting better. And I think what I found interesting with the new report is that I found they took a more sort of active stance, active commitment in terms of calling out governments and telling them, well, there's no time to do bullshit anymore. We need real solutions. I don't think policymakers, I think increasingly we're seeing more serious people trying to tackle those issues, but the only solutions that we've been creating so far are hugely inadequate, and they're not enough to solve the climate crisis. But for yeah, that's what I can say.
Thank you. Yes, for us watching the climate news daily, it's unfortunate, but we didn't think that there was going to be a magic solution that has suddenly happened, and that the situation is getting worse. I wonder if anybody else has any questions for Mei. If so, you can raise your hand. You can also put it in the chat. But if there are no more questions, Mei, I just want to thank you so much for such an interesting session, and thank you for your work and your research. It's really important for creating a gender just, sustainable peace, as you said, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Well, I really appreciate being here, and thank you for inviting me. It's been great. Yeah.
Thanks.